In an upscale Chicago restaurant kitchen, arrogant executive chef Maxwell Richards stares condescendingly at James Carter. With a cruel smile, he forces the seemingly inexperienced 65-year-old veteran to prepare beef Wellington. Maxwell doesn't know James once cooked for 3 presidents and 5-star generals. James Carter stood quietly in the gleaming kitchen of Elevation, one of Chicago's most acclaimed restaurants. His weathered hands, steady from decades of military precision, rested calmly at his sides. At 65, his silver hair was neatly trimmed in a military-style cut, his posture still ramrod straight despite his age. He wore no fancy chef's coat, just plain black pants and a white button-up shirt. "I'm looking for a line cook position," he had told the hostess earlier that morning, using a civilian name rather than his military title. James was researching a book about American culinary traditions after serving 30 years as a master chef in the military, where he had cooked for generals, diplomats, and 3 sitting presidents. Maxwell Richards, Elevation's executive chef, barely glanced at his resume. At 42, he'd built a reputation for technical precision and tyrannical management. His tall frame and perpetually stern expression intimidated everyone in his kitchen. "Experience?" he snapped, blue eyes cold. "Military kitchen service." James replied truthfully, downplaying his culinary pedigree. "Officers' mess halls mostly." Maxwell scoffed. "Army slop, you mean? We need extra hands for the senator's dinner tomorrow. You'll prep vegetables today. Don't cut yourself, old man." James nodded respectfully. Throughout the morning, he worked quietly, observing the kitchen's dynamic. Maxwell berated his staff constantly, sending dishes back for minor imperfections while taking credit for every successful plate. Several times, Maxwell hovered over James's station, criticizing his technique despite his perfect execution. "This isn't some military canteen," he sneered. "We maintain standards here." James nodded, hiding his amusement. The knife technique he was using had been taught to him by a Japanese chef during a diplomatic mission, a method clearly beyond Maxwell's understanding. The following day, Elevation was in chaos preparing for a special dinner, hosting a senator and military officials. Maxwell paced the kitchen, barking orders and finding fault with everyone's work. The pressure was palpable as staff rushed to arrange elaborate appetizers and prepare complex sauces. "You!" Maxwell suddenly pointed at James, who was quietly preparing vegetables. "Get over here." James approached calmly, wiping his hands on his apron. "We have a VIP table of military brass that specially requested beef Wellington," Maxwell announced loudly enough for the entire kitchen to hear. "Since you claim to have military cooking experience, let's see what you can do." A hush fell over the kitchen. Everyone knew Maxwell's beef Wellington was his signature dish, one he personally prepared for important guests. It was also notoriously difficult, requiring perfect timing and technique. "Sir, I've never made your version before," James replied quietly, his military habit of addressing superiors still intact. "Exactly," Maxwell smiled coldly. "Let's see this military training in action. Either you make it perfectly or you're fired." He glanced pointedly at James's lined face. "Not many restaurant hiring cooks your age, are there?" Chef Daniel, the sous chef, whispered as he passed. "He's setting you up to fail. Nobody touches his Wellington recipe." The other cooks exchanged knowing glances. They'd seen this before, Maxwell publicly humiliating staff to establish dominance. The fact that James was significantly older than most kitchen staff made the situation particularly uncomfortable. James examined the recipe card. It was technically correct, but lacked the nuances that elevated a good Wellington to greatness. The mushroom duxelle called for basic cremini mushrooms, not the blend of varieties he perfected during a diplomatic dinner at NATO headquarters. The pastry technique was standard, missing several key steps he'd learned from a French chef during his time at the Pentagon. As Maxwell walked away with a satisfied smirk, James felt a familiar sensation, the focused calm that had served him through decades of high-pressure military service. This Wellington wouldn't just meet Maxwell's expectations. It would exceed them in ways a younger chef couldn't imagine. He began gathering ingredients, his movements precise and efficient. The kitchen staff watched, fascinated by his sudden transformation from quiet prep cook to someone who moved with unmistakable military precision and culinary authority. James tied his apron more securely and assessed the situation with tactical precision. He had roughly 3 hours to create a masterpiece. Around him, staff stole curious glances while Maxwell periodically walked by, his expression smug as he expected the older man's imminent failure. First, James inspected the beef tenderloin, running his fingers along its surface with the same attention he once gave to preparing meals for Joint Chiefs of Staff. The meat was good quality but not exceptional. He knew that proper preparation could compensate for this. Next, he examined the mushrooms, puff pastry, and other ingredients, mentally cataloging how to maximize their potential, the same way he'd once managed limited supplies on remote military bases. Need some help figuring out where to start, old-timer? Maxwell asked mockingly, leaning against the counter. No, thank you, James replied evenly. I'm just assessing what I'm working with. It's just beef Wellington, not an Emery, Maxwell said loudly enough for others to hear. Though I suppose for someone with your limited experience and age, it might as well be rocket science. Several cooks winced at his condescension. Daniel, the sous chef, shot James a sympathetic look. Maxwell continued hovering, pointing out supposed inefficiencies in James's prep work. The mushrooms need to be chopped much finer. This is an army chow. James nodded politely, but continued working his way. He reduced the mushrooms with precision, adding a touch of Madeira wine he'd found in the pantry. Not in Maxwell's recipe, but crucial for depth of flavor. It was a technique he perfected when cooking for a general's retirement ceremony years ago. He worked methodically, his hands moving with practiced confidence through each step. The kitchen staff began noticing something unusual. Despite Maxwell's badgering, James seemed completely unfazed. More striking was how he handled each ingredient with respect and intuition that spoke of experience far beyond what his resume suggested. When he prepared the duxelle, he didn't measure ingredients but judged them by smell and texture, a skill honed through decades of cooking in various conditions. When James seared the tenderloin, he never checked the time, but knew exactly when to turn it by the caramelization of the crust. You're going to overcook it, Maxwell stated flatly. Without looking up, James replied, it needs another 20 seconds on this side for a proper Maillard reaction. His voice carried the natural authority of someone who had once commanded military kitchens. Maxwell blinked, surprised by the technical term and confident tone. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face as he watched James work. The kitchen had fallen into a strange rhythm. Other preparations continued, but James had become the focal point. His movements were deliberate, almost hypnotic, the practiced gestures of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times under pressure. As he prepared the mushroom duxelle, he altered Maxwell's recipe subtly but significantly. He added shallots caramelized to the edge of sweetness, a whisper of fresh thyme, and a splash of cognac that flamed dramatically before being incorporated. A technique he learned while cooking for a diplomatic function at the American Embassy in Paris. The aroma that rose from his station drew appreciative sniffs from passing cooks. That's not my recipe, Maxwell interjected, his voice tighter than before. You're right, James acknowledged calmly. I'm adding elements I learned cooking for Admiral Thompson's retirement. They complement the beef profile. My Wellington doesn't need improvement, Maxwell snapped. James just smiled. Consider it an interpretation rather than an improvement. In the military, we adapt. The tenderloin, now perfectly seared, rested as he worked on the pastry. His hands moved with exceptional speed and dexterity, creating a lattice pattern so intricate and precise that several staff members paused their work to watch. Daniel couldn't contain his curiosity. Where did you learn that technique? He whispered when Maxwell stepped away. On the USS Lincoln. James replied simply, omitting that he'd actually invented the technique, which had since been adopted by Navy chefs throughout the fleet. When it came time to construct the Wellington, James assembled the components with surgical precision. He wrapped the tenderloin in prosciutto, then the mushroom mixture, creating perfect, even layers. The puff pastry enveloped everything with no air pockets or tears, a technical achievement that even Maxwell couldn't criticize. You need to egg wash it twice for proper color, Maxwell instructed, finding something to correct. James nodded, but added a sprinkle of flaky sea salt after the second wash, a signature touch that had become his trademark during state dinners at military headquarters. As James worked, a peculiar transformation occurred in the kitchen's atmosphere. The staff, initially amused by Maxwell's attempt to humiliate the older newcomer, now watched with growing respect. Even Maxwell's demeanor shifted subtly from condescension to watchful curiosity. When James slid the Wellington into the oven, he didn't set a timer. "Aren't you timing it?" Maxwell challenged. "I'll know when it's ready." James replied, 42 minutes at 400 degrees. Maxwell insisted. James shook his head slightly. "This one needs 38 minutes. The thickness of the pastry and the temperature of the meat before wrapping affect cooking time." Maxwell stared at him, brow furrowed, as if seeing him properly for the first time. While the Wellington baked, James began preparing accompaniments, another deviation from protocol, as Maxwell normally assigned these tasks to other cooks. He reduced red wine and veal stock into a silken sauce, adding a knob of butter at the end for a perfect sheen. Maxwell watched with increasing intensity, saying nothing but observing every move. The kitchen staff sensed a shifting dynamic. Something about this unassuming older hire didn't fit. He worked with too much confidence, too much precision. Daniel approached Maxwell. "Chef, there's something strange about his technique. The way he handles a knife, the way he tastes everything, it's like what?" Maxwell demanded. "Like watching a master," Daniel finished quietly. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. He pulled out his phone and began searching something, his expression growing more troubled with each swipe. 37 minutes after placing the Wellington in the oven, James moved toward it without checking a clock. "It's only been 37 minutes," Maxwell called out, checking his watch. "It's ready," James stated simply. "You can't possibly know that." James turned to Maxwell, and for the first time his polite deference fell away. He stood straighter, his military bearing unmistakable. "The pastry has achieved optimal color. The internal temperature of the beef will be precisely 128 degrees, which will rise to 132 during resting. A perfect medium rare. The aromas indicate proper caramelization of the pastry, without over-rendering the fat in the prosciutto layer." The kitchen went completely silent. No one spoke with such authority to Chef Maxwell, especially not a cook on his second day. More striking was the technical language he used, the vocabulary of an executive chef, not a line cook. James maintained eye contact with Maxwell, a silent challenge his gaze. Without breaking that contact, he opened the oven door and retrieved the Wellington, which was indeed a perfect golden brown. James placed the beef Wellington on the marble counter to rest. It was a vision of culinary perfection. The pastry golden and glossy, the lattice work maintaining its definition, the structure perfectly proportioned. A rich, enticing aroma filled the kitchen. 7 minutes to rest before slicing, he announced, his tone no longer deferential but matter-of-fact. Maxwell stared at the creation, then back at his phone screen. His face had paled slightly. "Your name is James Carter," he said slowly. "Yes, but you're not just any military cook. You're Master Chief James Carter, presidential culinary specialist, former head chef of the Pentagon Executive Dining Facility, recipient of the Culinary Excellence Medal, and personal chef to 3 presidents." A collective gasp traveled through the kitchen. Staff members who had been pretending not to listen abandoned all pretense, turning to stare openly. "Guilty," James acknowledged, removing his apron, "though I've been retired for the past 2 years. That's impossible," stammered a young line cook. "He's a legend. They call him the General of Gastronomy." "Actually, I'm standing right here," James replied with gentle humor. "And that nickname was always a bit embarrassing." "Why are you here?" Maxwell demanded. "To spy on my techniques? To steal my recipes?" James raised an eyebrow. "I'm researching a book about American restaurant culture, about finding joy in cooking again." He gestured around the kitchen. "Though I must say, there doesn't seem to be much joy in this particular kitchen." Before Maxwell could respond, Daniel approached the Wellington and asked, "May I?" James nodded. "It's ready now." With reverent care, Daniel sliced through the Wellington. The cross-section revealed perfectly defined layers. The pastry crisp yet delicate, the duxelle dark and aromatic, the beef a perfect rosy medium rare, with juices pooling but not running. Magnifique, Daniel whispered, slipping into French in his awe. Maxwell stared at the perfect slice, his professional eye unable to find a single flaw. For a moment, the conflict on his face was painful to watch, the clash between his pride and his recognition of undeniable mastery. James picked up a small spoon and dipped it into the sauce he'd prepared. He tasted it critically, then added a single grain of salt and stirred. Perfect, he concluded. Then, with the quiet authority that had once commanded the finest military kitchens, he said, "Plate it. Our guests are waiting." 2 weeks later, James stood in Elevation's kitchen for the last time. The atmosphere had changed dramatically. There was focus and discipline, but also laughter and collaboration. Maxwell moved through the space with the same exacting standards, but new approach, teaching rather than terrorizing. "I still can't believe you're actually leaving," Daniel said, helping him pack his notebooks. "My research here is complete," James replied with a smile. "Besides, I have 6 more restaurants to visit before my book is finished." Maxwell approached, more relaxed than James had ever seen him. The senator's office called again. "They're requesting your Wellington recipe." "And yours," James reminded him. "The collaboration we discuss." Maxwell nodded, a hint of excitement breaking through his typically serious demeanor. "I've been working on those fusion concepts we talked about. The test dishes are promising." As James prepared to leave, Maxwell extended his hand. "Your legacy here will last." James shook it firmly. "Not my legacy, just a reminder of what's possible when we cook with both precision and passion. If this story touched your heart, remember that true mastery comes from both skill and character. Experience deserves respect. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this journey, subscribe for more stories of unexpected wisdom.